Mr. President, I rise today to speak about a bipartisan common sense amendment that members of this body endorsed yesterday by unanimous consent. I want to thank Chairman Baucus for his work that he and his staff to manage this important job creation package that we took a step on yesterday. I want to thank Senator Crapo for co-sponsoring this bipartisan amendment and Senator Coburn for his ideas and support. My amendment is simple. It amends the Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, or what I think most folks would commonly refer to as the stimulus, to correct gaps in oversight and transparency. It provides much-needed additional accountability for these public investments, again, that have come about through the stimulus package. I voted for the stimulus. It was one of the first and toughest votes that I cast as a new member of this body. And I've worked hard to make sure that my state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, has had opportunities to compete for its fair share of its funding. Now, the Recovery Act, the stimulus, was not perfect, and reasonable people can debate whether or not it was necessary or whether or not it was ambitious enough. But I do think it's fair to say that a majority of the economists of all political stripes and across most of the ideological spectrum now agree a year later that while imperfect, the stimulus package prevented our battered economy from sliding over a cliff last spring into what I think could have been a full-scale economic depression. Almost a year ago, I remember coming to this floor for one of my first presentations, and I stood here on the Senate floor and spoke about my concerns about the potential challenges of implementing a piece of legislation as big as the Recovery Act. At that time, I said we needed to come up with a common set of definitions and performance metrics that would allow us to honestly measure our progress as these stimulus dollars were pumped into our economy. Now, I know that metrics, performance indicators, and other things, many members' eyes start to glaze over when you go into these kind of discussions. But if we're going to be truly responsible to the people of this country, it is our job to make sure that we put in place, particularly when we're starting new programs, those kind of performance metrics. As the chair knows, prior to being senator, I had the opportunity to be governor, and the hallmark of my administration was that what gets measured gets done. And my sense was, as we started down the ambitious path around the Recovery Act, we needed to have that same kind of metrics in place. I suggested a year ago requiring specific timelines and checkpoints so that we could better track the outcome of programs funded with stimulus dollars. I discussed at that time steps we could take to hold Recovery Act recipients more accountable. I actually recommended delaying or deferring stimulus payments if progress wasn't adequately demonstrated or appropriately reported. Well, here we are a year later, and while I do believe at the macro level a lot of the stimulus activities have accomplished their goals, it appears that requirements for program reporting and disclosure of spending plans have gone missing or not just been reported, and that the notion of putting in place, in effect, a business plan for some of the new programs of this legislation have never fully been vetted. The amendment that this body adopted yesterday, this bipartisan amendment, we've successfully included fixes to make sure that on a going forward basis, we won't have this problem. Now, when we passed the Recovery Act 1 year ago, we required recipients to report quarterly. We required agencies to post the reports, and we established an oversight board to tackle issues of waste, fraud, and abuse, the Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board. We required the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, various inspectors generals, and the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to provide oversight. You would think with all of this reporting and oversight that we would have it totally covered. We'd have thought through all of the ramifications. Unfortunately, a year later, we found that that's not the case. Not that anyone here needs a recap, but I think it is fair to once again explain, and I don't think, particularly those of us who supported the Recovery Act and the administration, ever did a very good job of actually explaining to the American people what was in the Recovery Act. So not a long recap, but I do think it's important for the viewers and my colleagues to recall what it was. Literally, one-third, more than one-third of the stimulus acts was tax cuts. $288 billion of tax cuts. $288 billion of tax cuts. I believe that it was, in effect, the third largest tax cut in American history. Yet as I travel Virginia, and the presiding officer I know travels the great state of Illinois, I very rarely find a constituent who realizes that the stimulus had a huge amount of tax cuts. Now, we've only paid out about less than half of those dollars, but a third of the stimulus was tax cuts. A second third was direct assistance to state and local governments. I can tell you, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I sometimes run into the legislators there, some folks from the other side who oftentimes will say to me, you know, Senator, we're going to keep kicking you in the tail about the stimulus, but keep sending those checks, because otherwise we'd be right down the tubes at the state level. And oftentimes these dollars have gone to prevent what would have been otherwise catastrophic layoffs in our schools, in our highway departments, providing health care. And many governments, many state governments who are now working on a biennium budgets are finding in the second year of the budget, when the stimulus dollars run out, the enormous budget shortfalls they're going to face. Again, many of our constituents, because these didn't necessarily create new jobs, but prevented massive additional layoffs, I'm not sure we conveyed that to folks adequately. The third part of the stimulus package, in the category that I'm primarily concerned with today, and the focus of my amendment, included significant new investments in our nation's economic infrastructure. These are areas that this body and policymakers have talked about for years, but we never really put our monies where our mouth was until the stimulus. This area includes such important policy goals as smart grid, investing in high-speed rail, making sure that we've got the power of information technology to transform our healthcare industry, to make it more productive and cost-effective. So we've got significant dollars on healthcare IT. And in an area that I'm particularly interested in, deployment of broadband across our rural communities. As you can see in this third category, as of mid-February, we've only paid out about $80 billion of a total of $275 billion. And it has now become clear that many of the programs in this third category are what I would term high risk. That means they include federal programs that saw enormous increases in funding and new responsibilities. Some of these programs barely existed a year and a half ago. They had before relatively modest priorities. But now, broadband, we've seen a 100-fold increase. Healthcare IT, dramatic increases. These programs have had a year to gear up, but we've got to make sure that they've actually got business plans that can be vetted. In some cases, these stimulus funds were actually designated for brand new priorities and new programs. Now, many of these programs are just now, a year later, getting their stimulus funds out the door. And here's the challenge. Here's the challenge that my amendment will address. We simply don't know, a year in, and with $80 billion being spent out, very much about how these high-risk programs are actually doing in terms of delivering broadband, healthcare IT, smart grid. For example, let me turn to the next chart. On the website recovery.gov, you learn that the Energy Department has paid out about $2.5 billion in stimulus money so far. Close to another $24 billion remains to be spent out. And if you look even further, you find that the Energy Department complied with OMB requirements last year to come up with an implementation plan for its weatherization assistance program. The Energy Department plan set a clear and reasonable goal. It said it would use stimulus dollars to weatherize 50,000 homes across the country in 2009. Now, weatherization programs are geared for low-income homes. They help the homeowners. They decrease energy costs, decrease our commitment on foreign oil. There's a lot of good in this program. But a report from the Energy Department just 3 weeks ago shows that these funds actually paid to weatherize only 30,000 or so homes in 2009. That means the program missed the goal by 20,000 homes. That's a score of 60%. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, 60% was not a passing grade. So we should be concerned that almost every dollar of the $5 billion program for weatherization has already been awarded. We've got to make sure that we're getting the results we were promised. How can we have confidence that these grants already in the pipeline for this year are going to be properly managed? We must have more transparency and accountability from the Energy Department about how they're managing this program and overseeing the spending of these funds. There's the same kind of challenges around the Smart Grid program. And I'm not just picking on the Department of Energy. If you look in each of these other areas, healthcare, IT, rail, you find the similar challenges. Now, there's no information beyond once these funds are distributed how these funds distribution fits into the overall management of these important new programs. That information should be easily accessible and available to our taxpayers, and it should be reported on a regular basis to those of us in Congress who have this oversight responsibility. If these agencies are not meeting their milestones or deadlines, and if stimulus programs are not producing measurable results, we need to know about it. If there are problems or potential barriers to distributing these stimulus funds, we in the Congress and the administration could do more to support reasonable solutions. We should be able to work together to fix the management barriers that have slowed down this work. Mr. President, it's not too late. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the government spent only about 18% of the stimulus funds in fiscal year '09. By the end of this fiscal year, that means October of this year, 2010, that number grows to about 54%, but that still means over half of the dollars will be spent out after October of this year. So that means much of the stimulus funding remains in the pipeline. And that means we have an opportunity now to correct any management and transparency gaps. So our amendment, with this body adopted, will do that in three important ways. So if we can put up the final chart. First, it requires agencies to update and refine their implementation plans they developed last year for these high-risk programs. Now, we define high risk as any program that received more than $2 billion or any program that saw a funding increase of 150% or more from the previous year funding. These are the programs that went from quite small to ramping up into huge amounts. It also includes brand new programs. Under our amendment, these programs will be required to update their stimulus implementation and oversight plans by July 1st. As a former business guy, what that means in more kind of less legislative speak, they got to show us their business plan in a way that is intelligible and understandable to the taxpayers and to Congress by July 1st. Second, our amendment will require these high-risk programs to report their outcomes to Congress and taxpayers every quarter beginning September 30th. We can't wait for a year to go by before whether we see these programs that are spending and expending billions of dollars are actually achieving their goals. These reports must include relevant information on spending and outcomes that clearly measure whether or not these programs are working and meeting the goals defined basically in the business plans that they would have submitted by July 1st. And finally, our amendment adds an enforcement mechanism to make sure that federal agencies, members of Congress, and the public have access to the information they deserve to evaluate whether or not these stimulus investments are actually working. You know, one of the things we found that close to 1,000 recipients of stimulus funding in this last quarter never even filed the required reports so that we know, and the taxpayers know how these dollars are being spent. So the amendment will impose civil and financial penalties on stimulus grant recipients who deliberately or consistently fail to comply with quarterly reporting requirements. The amendment provides, of course, sufficient discretion for the Attorney General and the courts to set these penalties and to make sure there is consideration whether the recipient is a nonprofit organization or a unit of state and local government or a small business. Again, we're not trying to unduly penalize, but we want to put some teeth in the fact that these organizations that are recipients of federal funds, that they document what they're doing with those funds. This is basic business accountability. Mr. President, once again, I applaud my colleagues for stepping up in a responsible and bipartisan way to correct obvious gaps in the management and accountability and transparency of the Recovery Act programs. With so much of the stimulus funding still in the pipeline, this amendment will allow us to dramatically improve the way we measure and report outcomes and demonstrate accurate, verifiable results for the taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.